Benjamin.Disraeli, 1st Earl of Beaconsfield KG, PCFRS, was a British politician and writer who twice served as Prime Minister. He played a central role in the creation of the modern Conservative Party, defining its policies and its broad outreach. Disraeli is remembered for his influential voice in world affairs, his political battles with the Liberal Party leader William Ewart Gladstone, and his one-nation conservatism or Tory democracy. He made the Conservatives the party most identified with the glory and power of the British Empire. He is the only British Prime Minister of Jewish birth. Disraeli was born in London. His father left Judaism after a dispute at his synagogue. Young Benjamin became an Anglican at the age of 12. After several unsuccessful attempts, Disraeli entered the House of Commons in 1837. In 1846, the Prime Minister, Sir Robert Peel, split the party over his proposal to repeal the Corn Laws, which involved ending the tariff on imported grain. Disraeli clashed with Peel in the Commons. Disraeli became a major figure in the party. When Lord Derby, the party leader, thrice formed governments in the 1850s and 1860s, Disraeli served as Chancellor of the Exchequer and leader of the House of Commons. He also forged a bitter rivalry with Gladstone of the Liberal Party. Upon Derby's retirement in 1868, Disraeli became Prime Minister briefly before losing that year's election. He returned to opposition, before leading the party to a majority in the 1874 election. He maintained a close friendship with Queen Victoria, who in 1876 created him Earl of Beaconsfield. Disraeli's second term was dominated by the Eastern Question, the slow decay of the Ottoman Empire and a desire of other European powers, such as Russia, to gain at its expense. Disraeli arranged for the British to purchase a major interest in the Suez Canal Company. In 1878, faced with Russian victories against the Ottomans, he worked at the Congress of Berlin to obtain peace in the Balkans, terms favorable to Britain and unfavorable to Russia, its long-standing enemy. This diplomatic victory over Russia established Disraeli as one of Europe's leading statesmen. World events thereafter moved against the Conservatives. Controversial wars in Afghanistan and South Africa undermined his public support. He angered British farmers by refusing to reinstitute the Corn Laws in response to poor harvests and cheap imported grain. With Gladstone conducting a massive speaking campaign, his Liberals bested Disraeli's Conservatives in the 1880 election. In his final months, Disraeli led the Conservatives in opposition. He had throughout his career written novels, beginning in 1826, and he published his last completed novel, Endymion, shortly before he died at the age of 76. Early life. Childhood. Disraeli was born on the 21st of December 1804 at 6 Kings Road, Bedford Row, Bloomsbury, London, the second child and eldest son of Isaac Disraeli, a literary critic and historian, and Maria and Equity Bassivi. The family was of Sephardic Jewish-Italian mercantile background. All Disraeli's grandparents and great-grandparents were born in Italy. Isaac's father, Benjamin, moved to England from Venice in 1748. Disraeli later romanticized his origins, claiming that his father's family was of Grand Spanish and Venetian descent. In fact, Isaac's family was of no great distinction, but on Disraeli's mother's side, in which he took no interest, there were some highly distinguished forebears. Historians differ on Disraeli's motives for rewriting his family history. Bernard Glassman argues that it was intended to give him status comparable to that of England's ruling elite. Sarah Bradford believes his dislike of the commonplace would not allow him to accept the facts of his birth as being as middle-class and undramatic as they really were. Disraeli's siblings were Sarah, Naphtali, Ralph, and James. He was close to his sister, and on affectionate but more distant terms with his surviving brothers. Details of his schooling are sketchy. For the age of about 6 he was a day boy at a dame school in Islington that one of his biographers later described as, for those days, a very high-class establishment. 2 years later or so, the exact date has not been ascertained, he was sent as a boarder to Rev. John Potticary's St. Piran's School at Blackheath. While he was there, events at the family home changed the course of Disraeli's education and of his whole life. His father renounced Judaism and had the 4 children baptized into the Church of England in July and August 1817. Isaac Disraeli had never taken religion very seriously, but had remained a conforming member of the Bevis Marks synagogue. His father, the elder Benjamin, was a prominent and devout member. It was probably from respect for him that Isaac did not leave when he fell out with the synagogue authorities in 1813. After Benjamin Sr. died in 1816, Isaac felt free to leave the congregation following a second dispute. Isaac's friend Sharon Turner, who was a solicitor, convinced him that although he could comfortably remain unattached to any formal religion, it would be disadvantageous to the children if they did. So, Turner stood as godfather when Benjamin was baptized, aged 12, on the 31st of July 1817. Conversion to Christianity enabled Disraeli to contemplate a career in politics. Britain in the early 19th century was not a greatly anti-Semitic society, and there had been members of Parliament from Jewish families since Samson Gideon in 1770. But until 1858 MPs were required to take the oath of allegiance on the true faith of a Christian, necessitating at least nominal conversion. It is not known whether Disraeli formed any ambition for a parliamentary career at the time of his baptism, but there is no doubt that he bitterly regretted his parents' decision not to send him to Winchester College. As one of the great public schools of England, Winchester consistently provided recruits of the political elite. His 2 younger brothers were sent there, and it is not clear why Isaac Disraeli chose to send his eldest son to a much less prestigious school. The boy evidently held his mother responsible for the decision. Bradford speculates that Benjamin's delicate health and his obviously Jewish appearance may have had something to do with it. The school chosen for him was run by Eleazar Cogan at Higham Hill in Walthamstow. He began there in the autumn term of 1817. He later recalled his education. "I was at school for 2 or 3 years under the Rev. Dr. Cogan, a Greek scholar of eminence, who had contributed notes to the Aeschylus of Bishop Blomfield, and was himself the editor of the Greek Gnostic poets. After this I was with a private tutor for 2 years in my own county, and my education was severely classical, too much so, in the pride of boyish erudition, I edited the Idonesian Eclogue of Theocritus, W.H. was privately printed. This was my first production, puerile pedantry, 1820s. In November 1821, shortly before his 17th birthday, Disraeli was articled as a clerk to a firm of solicitors, Swain, Stevens, Maples, Pearce and Hunt, in the City of London. T.F. Maples was not only the young Disraeli's employer and friend of his father's, but also his prospective father-in-law. Isaac and Maples entertained the possibility that the latter's only daughter might be a suitable match for Benjamin. A friendship developed, but there was no romance. The firm had a large and profitable business, and as the biographer R. W. Davis observes, the clerkship was the kind of secure, respectable position that many fathers dream of for their children. Although biographers including Robert Blake and Bradford comment that such a post was incompatible with Disraeli's romantic and ambitious nature, he reportedly gave his employers satisfactory service, and later professed to have learned a good deal from his time with the firm. He recalled, "I had some scruples, for even then I dreamed of Parliament. My father's refrain always was, Philip Carteret Webb, who was the most eminent solicitor of his boyhood and who was an MP. It would be a mistake to suppose that the 2 years and more that I was in the office of our friend were wasted. I have often thought, though I have often regretted the university, that it was much the reverse." The year after joining Maples's firm, Benjamin changed his surname from Disraeli to Disraeli. His reasons for doing so are unknown, but the biographer Bernard Glassman surmises that it was to avoid being confused with his father. Disraeli's sister and brothers adopted the new version of the name Isaac, and his wife retained the older form. Disraeli toured Belgium and the Rhine Valley with his father in the summer of 1824. He later wrote that it was while traveling on the Rhine that he decided to abandon his position. "I determined when descending those magical waters that I would not be lawyer." On the return to England he left the solicitors, at the suggestion of Maples, with the aim of qualifying as a barrister. He enrolled as a student at Lincoln's Inn and joined the chambers of his uncle, Nathaniel Basavy, and then those of Benjamin Austin, who persuaded Isaac that Disraeli would never make a barrister and should be allowed to pursue a literary career. He had made a tentative start. In May 1824 he submitted a manuscript to his father's friend, the publisher John Murray, but withdrew it before Murray could decide whether to publish it. Released from the law, Disraeli did some work for Murray, but turned most of his attention not to literature but to speculative dealing on the stock exchange. There was at the time a boom in shares in South American mining companies. Spain was losing its South American colonies in the face of rebellions. At the urging of George Canning, the British government recognized the new independent governments of Argentina, Colombia and Mexico. With no money of his own, Disraeli borrowed money to invest. He became involved with the financier J.D. Powles, who was prominent among those encouraging the mining boom. In the course of 1825, Disraeli wrote 3 anonymous pamphlets for Powles, promoting the companies. The pamphlets were published by John Murray, who invested heavily in the boom. Murray had for some time had ambitions to establish a new morning paper to compete with the Times. In 1825 Disraeli convinced him that he should proceed. The new paper, The Representative, promoted the mines and those politicians who supported them, particularly Canning. Disraeli impressed Murray with his energy and commitment to the project, but he failed in his key task of persuading the eminent writer John Gibson Lockhart to edit the paper. After that, Disraeli's influence on Murray waned, and to his resentment he was sidelined in the affairs of the Representative. The paper survived for only 6 months, partly because the mining bubble burst in late 1825, and partly because, according to Blake, the paper was atrociously edited, and would have failed regardless. The bursting of the mining bubble was ruinous for Disraeli. By June 1825 he and his business partners had lost £7,000. Disraeli could not pay off the last of his debts from this debacle until 1849. He turned to writing. Motivated partly by his desperate need for money, and partly by a wish for revenge on Murray and others by whom he felt slighted, there was a vogue for what was called silver fork fiction, novels depicting aristocratic life, usually by anonymous authors, read avidly by the aspirational middle classes. Disraeli's first novel, Vivian Grey, published anonymously in 4 volumes in 1826–27, was a thinly veiled retelling of the affair of the Representative. It sold well, but caused much offense in influential circles when the authorship was discovered. Disraeli, then just 23, did not move in high society, as the numerous solecisms in his book made obvious. Reviewers were sharply critical on these grounds of both the author and the book. Furthermore, Murray and Lockhart, men of great influence in literary circles, believed that Disraeli had caricatured them and abused their confidence, an accusation denied by the author but repeated by many of his biographers. In later editions Disraeli made many changes, softening his satire, but the damage to his reputation proved long-lasting. Disraeli's biographer Jonathan Parry writes that the financial failure and personal criticism that Disraeli suffered in 1825 and 1826 were probably the trigger for a serious nervous crisis affecting him over the next 4 years. He had always been moody, sensitive, and solitary by nature, but now became seriously depressed and lethargic. Quote, "He was still living with his parents in London, but in search of the change of air recommended by the family's doctors. Isaac took a succession of houses in the country and on the coast, before Disraeli sought wider horizons." 1830s. Together with his sister's fiancé, William Meredith, Disraeli travelled widely in southern Europe and beyond in 1830–31. The trip was financed partly by another high society novel, The Young Duke, written in 1829–30. The tour was cut short suddenly by Meredith's death from smallpox in Cairo in July 1831. Despite this tragedy, and the need for treatment for a sexually transmitted disease on his return, Disraeli felt enriched by his experiences. He became, in Parry's words, aware of values that seemed denied to his insular countrymen. The journey encouraged his self-consciousness, his moral relativism, and his interest in Eastern racial and religious attitudes. Blake regards the tour as one of the formative experiences of Disraeli's whole career. The impressions that it made on him were life-lasting. They conditioned his attitude towards some of the most important political problems which faced him in his later years, especially the Eastern question. They also colored many of his novels. Disraeli wrote 2 novels in the aftermath of the tour. Contrini Fleming was avowedly a self-portrait. It is subtitled A Psychological Autobiography, and depicts the conflicting elements of its hero's character, the duality of northern and Mediterranean ancestry, the dreaming artist and the bold man of action. As Parry observes, the book ends on a political note, setting out Europe's progress from feudal to federal principles. The wondrous tale of Alroy the following year portrayed the problems of a medieval Jew in deciding between a small, exclusively Jewish state and a large empire embracing all. After the 2 novels were published, Disraeli declared that he would write no more about myself. He had already turned his attention to politics in 1832, during the Great Crisis over the Reform Bill. He contributed to an anti-Whig pamphlet edited by John Wilson Croker and published by Murray entitled England and France, or A Cure for Ministerial Gallomania. The choice of a Tory publication was regarded as strange by Disraeli's friends and relatives, who thought him more of a radical. Indeed, he had objected to Murray about Croker's inserting high Tory sentiment. Disraeli remarked, "It is quite impossible that anything adverse to the general measure of reform can issue from my pen." Moreover, at the time Gallomania was published, Disraeli was electioneering in Hull High Wycombe in the radical interest. Disraeli's politics at the time were influenced both by his rebellious streak and by his desire to make his mark. At the time, the politics of the nation were dominated by members of the aristocracy, together with a few powerful commoners. The Whigs derived from the coalition of lords who had forced through the Bill of Rights in 1689, and in some cases were their actual descendants, not merely spiritual. The Tories tended to support king and church, and sought to thwart political change. A small number of radicals, generally from northern constituencies, were the strongest advocates of continuing reform. In the early 1830s, the Tories and the interests they represented appeared to be a lost cause. The other great party, the Whigs, were anathema to Disraeli. Toryism is worn out, namp. I cannot condescend to be a Whig. There were two general elections in 1832. Disraeli unsuccessfully stood as a radical at High Wycombe in each. Disraeli's political views embrace certain radical policies, particularly democratic reform of the electoral system, and also some Tory ones, including protectionism. He began to move in Tory circles. In 1834 he was introduced to the former Lord Chancellor, Lord Lyndhurst, by Henrietta Sykes, wife of Sir Francis Sykes. She was having an affair with Lyndhurst, and began another with Disraeli. Disraeli and Lyndhurst took an immediate liking to each other. Lyndhurst was an indiscreet gossip with a fondness for intrigue. This appealed greatly to Disraeli, who became his secretary and go-between. In 1835, Disraeli stood for the last time as a radical, unsuccessfully contesting High Wycombe once again. In April 1835, Disraeli fought a by-election at Taunton as a Tory. The Irish MP Daniel O'Connell, misled by inaccurate press reports, thought Disraeli had slandered him while electioneering at Taunton. He launched an outspoken attack, referring to Disraeli as a reptile, just fit now, after being twice discarded by the people, to become a conservative. He possesses all the necessary requisites of perfidy, selfishness, depravity, want of principle, etc., which would qualify him for the change. His name shows that he is of Jewish origin. I do not use it as a term of reproach. There are many most respectable Jews, but there are, as in every other people, some of the lowest and most disgusting grade of moral turpitude, and of those I look upon Mr. Disraeli as the worst. Disraeli's public exchanges with O'Connell, extensively reproduced in the Times, included a demand for a duel with the 60-year-old O'Connell's son, a reference to the inextinguishable hatred with which shall pursue existence, and the accusation that O'Connell's supporters had a princely revenue wrung from a starving race of fanatical slaves. Disraeli was highly gratified by the dispute, which propelled him to general public notice for the first time. He did not defeat the incumbent Whig member, Henry Labouchere, but the Taunton constituency was regarded as unwinnable by the Tories. Disraeli kept Labouchere's majority down to 170, a good showing that put him in line for a winnable seat in the near future. With Lyndhurst's encouragement, Disraeli turned to writing propaganda for his newly adopted party. His vindication of the English Constitution was published in December 1835. It was couched in the form of an open letter to Lyndhurst, and in Bradford's view encapsulates a political philosophy that Disraeli adhered to for the rest of his life. Its themes were the value of benevolent aristocratic government, a loathing of political dogma, and the modernization of Tory policies. The following year he wrote a series of satires on politicians of the day, which he published in the Times under the pen name Runnymede. His targets included the Whigs, collectively and individually Irish nationalists, and political corruption. One essay ended. The English nation, therefore, rallies for rescue from the degrading plots of a profligate oligarchy, a barbarizing sectarianism, and a borough-mongering papacy, ran the hereditary leaders, the peers. The House of Lords, therefore, at this moment represents everything in the realm except the Whig oligarchs, the tools the dissenters, and the masters the Irish priests. In the meantime, the Whigs bawl that there is a collision. Quote, "It is true there is a collision, but it is not a collision between the Lords and the people, but between the ministers and the Constitution." Disraeli was now firmly in the Tory camp. He was elected to the exclusively Tory Carlton Club in 1836, and was also taken up by the party's leading hostess, Lady Londonderry. In June 1837, William IV died. The young Queen Victoria, his niece, succeeded him, and Parliament was dissolved. On the recommendation of the Carlton Club, Disraeli was adopted as a Tory parliamentary candidate at the ensuing general election.